My name is Walter Mace, and I am 76 years old. If you asked me 10 years ago what I thought the end of my life would look like, I would have described something quiet, dignified, a modest house with a porch swing, a mug of tea cooling beside me, maybe a newspaper folded on my lap. I imagined visits from my son, the occasional meal shared, a grandchild's laughter drifting in from the yard. Not every day. No, I was never one to ask for too much. Just enough to feel that I still belonged, that I was not fading into the wallpaper of time. For the better part of my adult life, I was a high school history teacher in New Haven. I taught generations of students about the rise and fall of empires, revolutions, treaties, wars both great and foolish. My wife, Helen, used to say I had a way of making dusty dates come alive, that when I spoke of Gettysburg or Normandy, you could almost smell the gunpowder. I loved my work, not because of the curriculum, but because of the chance to shape something lasting in the minds of teenagers who mostly thought history didn't matter. I retired at 71, a little later than most. I stayed as long as they let me. When the principal shook my hand at the farewell gathering, I remember thinking, that's it. I've stepped out of the story. Helen died a year later. Stroke. Sudden. 1 minute, she was humming in the kitchen, peeling carrots for soup. The next, I was calling 911 with shaking fingers and her head resting in my lap, her eyes distant like she'd already seen something she couldn't explain. We'd been married 48 years. She was my compass, my conversation, my rhythm. The silence after her was not merely quiet. It was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Her absence settled over the house like dust in unused rooms. I moved through the days performing the choreography of the living. Eat, clean, sleep, repeat, without much sense of why. Our son, Theodore, Ted as he prefers now, lives about 20 minutes away, in a newer part of town. He works in IT, always glued to a laptop or some blinking server. His wife, Sarah, is a dental hygienist and runs half the community events at their kids' school. They're busy people. That's what they always said when I called. We're just so busy, Dad. In the beginning, after Helen passed, they'd drop by once a week, then once every 2, then birthdays, then not even that. I'd leave voicemails. Ted, I just made that pear cobbler you used to like. Or, the news says we might get snow. Make sure the kids have warm coats. Sometimes he'd text back. Most times he wouldn't. Still, I didn't complain. I didn't want to be a burden. I've always believed that parents should not weigh down their children with expectations. That's what Helen and I agreed on. We saved, we paid off the house, we left everything tidy. But grief has a way of stretching time. One winter bled into another. I began to forget the taste of conversation. Some days I wouldn't speak a word until I said good night to Helen's photo on the mantel. I told myself I was fine, I was safe, warm, fed. I still had my books, my memories. But if I'm honest, I was afraid that I was becoming invisible, that the world was slowly folding me away like a letter no one meant to send. Then, one day last spring, Ted showed up unexpectedly. He stood in the doorway, tall in his trench coat, a rare seriousness in his eyes. "Dad," he said, "we need to talk." I remember the way my heart lifted just seeing him there. For a moment, I believed maybe he had come to invite me over for dinner, or that he'd found old photo albums he wanted help organizing. Instead, he sat me down and told me that he and Sarah had been talking, and they felt it was time for me to transition. That was the word he used, like I was some corporate project moving into phase 2. "You shouldn't be alone anymore," he said, his tone rehearsed but firm. "We worry. The house is too big. What if you fall? What if you forget the stove? What if something happens and no one finds you for days? I opened my mouth to protest, but something in his expression stopped me. There was no cruelty, but no softness either. Just efficiency. "We want you to come stay with us," he continued. "You'll have your own room, your own bathroom. We've already cleared out the back study. You'll be part of our household. We'll take care of everything." I didn't know what to say. I didn't want to be taken care of. I wasn't helpless. My knees hurt, sure, and my hearing wasn't what it once was, but I still paid my bills, cooked my meals, remembered all my passwords. But I saw how much Ted had prepared this pitch. He must have gone over it in his mind a dozen times before knocking on my door, and something in me, some lonely, tired part, wanted to believe it was real. That maybe he was trying to bridge the distance between us. So I nodded. I said yes. Ted smiled, relieved. He told me we'd move my things next weekend. Just the essentials. "We'll sell the house later," he said. "No rush. One thing at a time." I remember standing at the window after he left, watching his car pull away, wondering whether I had just been rescued or recruited. I tried to push that thought away. This was a new chapter. Maybe, just maybe, we would become a family again. Maybe Ted had finally remembered that I was still here. What I didn't know then was that care can wear many faces, and not all of them are kind. The move happened quickly. Ted arrived that Saturday with a rented van and a pair of movers he'd hired from a local service. "Let's keep it efficient," he said, clapping his hands as if overseeing a business operation. He brought a checklist. My favorite recliner, a few clothes, my medication, 2 boxes of books, and Helen's photo from the mantel. "You won't need the rest," he assured me. "We'll donate most of it, maybe hold a yard sale. No point keeping all this clutter." I stood in the middle of the living room I'd once painted with my wife, the same room where we spent New Year's nights sipping tea and watching fireworks from the window, and I nodded as they dismantled our life, piece by piece. The movers were swift. Within 2 hours, the house was nearly bare. As they wheeled out Helen's old armchair, her reading throne, she used to call it, I felt a pang I couldn't name. But Ted was already on the phone, directing things, talking about timelines and schedules. "We've got a new start ahead," he said, as if I were supposed to be grateful. Their house was in one of those pre-planned suburban neighborhoods, all identical 2-story homes with vinyl siding and symmetrical hedges. Their street was clean and wide and strangely quiet, as if life there had been politely muffled. Inside, the house felt cold, not in temperature, but in tone. Sarah met us at the door with a tight smile. "Dad, welcome," she said, taking a half-step back as if trying to avoid a hug. "The kids weren't home. At a sleepover," Sarah offered without elaboration. My new room was at the far end of the hall on the first floor. It had a single bed, a dresser, and a beige chair in the corner. The windows were small and didn't face the street. "We thought you'd prefer something simple," Sarah explained. "Less to trip over." Ted carried in the last box and placed it beside the dresser. "Here you go, Dad. Everything you need." At dinner that night, the conversation was sparse. Ted talked about work. Sarah talked about a bake sale. I tried to ask about the kids, my grandchildren, but they brushed it off. "They're teenagers, Dad," Ted said. "They've got their own world." I nodded, unsure how to insert myself into this new rhythm. After the meal, I offered to help clean up, but Sarah stopped me. "You just rest. We've got this." That became the first rule. I wasn't to touch anything. Not the dishwasher, not the stove, not the thermostat. "We just want to make sure you're comfortable," she said. No stress. But it didn't feel like comfort. It felt like containment. Over the next few days, the house settled into a routine that didn't seem to have space for me. Mornings began with Sarah tapping on my door with a tray. Toast, a boiled egg, a cup of lukewarm tea. "Eat up," she said, "and take your meds." I told her I could manage breakfast myself, but she insisted. "It's safer this way." I was given a pill organizer, even though I'd never missed a dose in my life. When I asked to make a pot of coffee, Sarah said the machine was finicky. Better let me handle it. When I asked to do laundry, Ted said the detergent pods were dangerous if mishandled. You'd be surprised how many elderly people end up in the ER over simple things. It was always said with a smile, with an edge of concern, but the effect was clear. I was not to touch anything. My phone vanished on the third day. I had left it on the nightstand, and when I woke up, it was gone. Ted said it must have been misplaced. "We'll get you a new one," he promised, but days passed and nothing came. I asked to use the house phone. Sarah hesitated. "We're trying to keep things quiet," she said. "The landline's mostly for emergencies." I realized then I hadn't heard a single ring since I arrived. I hadn't spoken to anyone outside the house. The television in the living room was locked on a streaming platform I didn't recognize. My favorite news channel wasn't available. I asked about it. Ted said he'd look into it. He never did. Small things began to shift in unsettling ways. One morning, I found the front door locked from the inside with a new digital code pad. When I asked about it, Sarah explained it was for safety. "We had an attempted break-in on this street last year," she said. Better to be cautious. I wasn't given the code. When I tried to open a window in my room for some fresh air, I found it screwed shut. "Allergies," Sarah said. "There's a lot of pollen this time of year." My walks, once a daily ritual, were now discouraged. "The sidewalk's uneven," Ted warned. "You don't want to fall. Just use the treadmill in the basement if you need exercise." The basement had no windows, and the treadmill was loud and old. I used it once. Never again. Then came the pills. Sarah handed them to me every morning with my breakfast tray. One was my regular heart medication. I recognized that. The others were new. She called them supplements and said the doctor recommended them. Memory support, joint relief, blood circulation, all natural, she assured me. But they made me drowsy. My thoughts became slower. My hands shook slightly. I began losing track of time. Some afternoons I'd wake up from a nap I didn't remember deciding to take, the daylight already fading from the windows. Once, I asked Sarah for the names of the pills. She told me not to worry. "Trust us. We're doing what's best for you." That phrase, "what's best for you," became their chorus. When I asked why I couldn't have my own key to the house, it was, "What's best for you?" When I asked why my mail was being redirected to their address without my consent, it was, "What's best for you?" When I asked why I hadn't heard from any friends, since I moved in, Sarah said she'd told them I needed rest. I felt less like a father and more like a patient. Or worse, a possession. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation between Ted and Sarah from the kitchen. They didn't know I was nearby. "We need to move forward on this," Sarah said, her voice low but urgent. The lawyer said it would take weeks to process. Ted sighed. "We need him to be cooperative, or at least confused enough not to object." "He already is," Sarah replied. "He slept 12 hours yesterday. I don't think he remembers where he put his glasses this morning." Ted chuckled. "Let's just keep the routine tight. He'll adjust." I backed away from the door before they noticed me. My heart was pounding. I returned to my room and sat on the bed, staring at the wall. What were they planning? What needed a lawyer? Why was my confusion something to be counted on? I tried to remember everything I'd signed since I moved in. There had been a medical release form, a document about family authorization. Ted had handed it to me casually during breakfast one morning, saying the insurance needed it. I had signed it without reading. A deep, slow dread began to rise in my chest. That night, I sat in the dark for hours, listening to the distant hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the floorboards. I realized I was trapped, not with chains or locks, but with politeness, with benevolent control disguised as care. And whatever kindness they once had for me had been replaced with procedure, like I was a task on a to-do list that kept getting more urgent. I didn't yet know what they were trying to take, but I knew they weren't giving anything in return. The true change came gradually, like water rising in a sealed room. At first, it was in the way Sarah began speaking to me, more slowly, as though I had trouble understanding, and with a tone usually reserved for restless children or pets being coaxed into obedience. "Walter, sweetie, let's not forget to take our pills, okay? That's a good boy." I remember the first time she called me that. A good boy. I stood there in the hallway, holding the glass of water she'd given me, stunned, half laughing out of disbelief. But she didn't notice, or she didn't care. She had already turned her back to me, flipping through her planner, already off to the next item on her mental list. Ted wasn't any better. He spoke to me less and less, and when he did, it was always to correct or redirect. "Don't touch that. Don't go in there. You don't need to worry about that, Dad." And then came the forms. One Tuesday morning, he appeared at my bedroom door holding a clipboard. "Hey, Dad," he said in that upbeat, artificially casual tone that always meant something unpleasant was coming. "There are a few things we need to take care of for insurance and your finances. Nothing serious, just some standard paperwork, legal housekeeping." I was sitting in my chair by the window, reading one of my old paperbacks. My reading glasses fogged slightly from the cup of tea resting on my knee. I looked up and saw the way he held the pen, already clicked, poised, the line of his jaw tight with anticipation. I reached for the clipboard, feeling uneasy. The text was small, and my eyes strained. "What's this one?" I asked, pointing to a paragraph marked with a highlighted sticker. "Oh, that's just a limited power of attorney," Ted said. "It lets me handle some of your financial stuff in case something happens. Banks are really picky these days. You know how it is." I didn't know how it was. I was 76, not senile. I still paid my own bills, balanced my checkbook by hand out of habit. I frowned. "Why would I need you to manage my accounts?" Ted gave a tight smile. "Just as a backup. It's not like I'm going to do anything without telling you." I didn't sign it that day. I said I wanted to read it carefully. That was the first time his mood soured. His smile faded like fog burned off by sun. "Sure, Dad," he said quietly. "Take your time." But he didn't leave the clipboard. He placed it gently on my nightstand, as if it would keep me company through the night. That evening at dinner, Sarah was oddly quiet. The children, who had been kept from me since the move, were still absent. I asked about them again, trying to keep my voice light. "Are Thomas and Ellie doing okay? I haven't seen them in a while." Sarah didn't meet my eyes. "They're very busy, Walter. School, sports, you know how it is." Her tone was clipped, and I noticed she didn't say their names. That struck me. Then Ted joined the conversation. "It's actually better this way, Dad. They don't need the stress. Teenagers are sensitive. We don't want them getting confused about your condition." I set my fork down. "My condition?" I asked. "What condition?" Sarah gave Ted a quick look. "Ted," she murmured, warning. But the damage was done. I stared at them both, feeling heat rise in my chest. "I'm not sick," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "I'm not confused. I'm not incompetent." Ted put his fork down slowly. "No one said you were, but Dad, you've been forgetful lately. You lost your phone. You tried to boil water and left the burner on. Sarah caught it just in time." That was a lie. I hadn't touched the stove in over a week because they wouldn't let me. "I've never boiled anything in this house," I said. "And I didn't lose my phone. It vanished." Sarah's smile was thin and tight. "Let's not argue. This is a calm household." I laughed once, short and bitter. "No, it's not. It's a prison with Wi-Fi and pastel curtains." That night I found that the lock on my bedroom door, the one on the inside, had been quietly disabled. I tried it after I shut the door. The knob turned freely. There was no resistance, no catch. I examined the edge with a flashlight and saw the screws had been removed, the latch hole left hollow. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, the clipboard still on my nightstand, the pen still there, waiting like a lure. Something inside me, something hardened from years of classroom politics and dealing with entitled parents and difficult teens, finally came awake. I picked up the clipboard and read every word of that power of attorney document. Then I took a red pen from my coat pocket and wrote across the first page in capital letters, "Declined. I am not incapable." I left it in the hallway, outside Ted and Sarah's bedroom door. The next morning, no one mentioned it. Breakfast was served without a word, the eggs a little overcooked, the tea weaker than usual. I noticed a subtle difference, though. Sarah's eyes didn't meet mine at all. Ted didn't say goodbye when he left for work. They were recalibrating, planning the next move. I could feel it like a weather change. Then came the surveillance. It started with the tablet left accidentally on the hallway shelf facing my door, its front camera always activated. Then the motion detector in my room that alerted them if I fell, but beeped quietly every time I stood up. I covered it with a sock. The next day, it was moved higher, out of reach. "Safety first," Ted said when I asked. "We just want to make sure you're okay when we're not home." I no longer believed anything he said. I began watching their routines, noting when the house was empty, when deliveries came, when their voices lowered behind closed doors. One afternoon I found the drawer in my dresser had been rifled through. My spare wallet, empty. The $50 I kept folded beneath my socks for emergencies, gone. My medical folder, missing a few pages. "You're imagining things," Sarah said when I confronted her. "Maybe you misplaced them." Her voice was too calm, too practiced. "You know, at your age—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. I stopped taking the pills. I started palming them, hiding them under my tongue, then spitting them into tissue when they weren't looking. Within 2 days, my fog began to lift. My thoughts sharpened. The headache behind my eyes faded. My appetite returned. That terrified them more than anything else. They wanted me docile. They wanted me slow. They wanted me to become the person they were describing to others behind my back. A confused, stumbling old man who didn't know what day it was. That was their narrative. They were building a case, slowly, carefully, one little incident at a time. And they were hoping I'd either not notice or not survive long enough to object. I began checking the mail when no one was home. Letters from banks I didn't recognize. Health records from clinics I'd never visited. A flyer from a senior living facility with a sticky note attached that read, "Good option." I took it all and hid it in a book in the back of my shelf, stuffing the pages tight. I started keeping a journal again, noting times, conversations, details. I didn't know exactly what they were building toward, but I knew it wasn't care. It was control. And I wasn't going to let them take me apart piece by piece while they smiled and said they loved me. The worst part was not their lies. It was the performance, the way they played their roles so well. In public, in front of neighbors, they were golden. "Oh, Dad's with us now," Sarah would say sweetly. "We're so blessed to have him here." Ted would squeeze my shoulder and nod like a loving son. "He's had a hard year," he'd say, "but we're making it work." And people would smile and say how lucky I was. They didn't see the cold meals, the monitoring, the isolation. They didn't hear the locks click at night. They didn't know my name had been removed from my own insurance documents, but I knew, and I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The final confirmation came not from a confrontation or an argument, but from a careless whisper, an overheard sentence that ripped the last veil from my eyes. It was a Wednesday, mid-morning, and the house was unusually quiet. Sarah had left for her dental clinic shift, and Ted was supposed to be working from his home office upstairs. I'd taken to pretending longer naps after breakfast, just so they would relax and drop their guard. That day, I cracked my bedroom door ever so slightly and listened to the hum of the house. Then I heard it, Ted on the phone in the hallway, pacing slowly, not aware I was awake. "Yes," he said, his voice low and flat. "The papers are ready. Once the cognitive evaluation comes back, we file. If we wait too long, he might catch on." There was a pause, then a sharp sigh. "No, he hasn't signed anything else. He's getting suspicious. Sarah's upping the supplements." Another pause. "I don't care if it looks unethical. We'll frame it as preventive care. He's barely coherent some days. The bank won't ask questions if the medical file backs it up." He walked past my door then, still talking, but my brain had frozen on one phrase. "The bank won't ask questions." Suddenly, everything they had been doing fit into a single, horrifying logic. They weren't just trying to manage me. They were trying to erase me, legally, financially, socially. They wanted guardianship. They wanted power of attorney. And ultimately, they wanted control over the modest savings I had built over a lifetime. They wanted the house, the pension, the insurance, the bank accounts. And they didn't want to wait until I died. They were engineering my disappearance as a man. I stood frozen beside the bed, my hand trembling on the edge of the nightstand. That sick feeling in my gut, the one I had been pushing aside for weeks, finally found its name. Betrayal. Not just negligence or insensitivity, but a calculated dismantling of my autonomy, orchestrated by the one person I once rocked to sleep, the boy I taught to ride a bike, who sat at my dinner table every night for 18 years. My own son. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I went into the bathroom and stared at my reflection in the mirror for what felt like hours. The face staring back at me looked older than I remembered, more sunken around the eyes, thinner at the neck, but it was still mine, still aware, still thinking. And that mattered. If I were still lucid, I could act. I could fight, but I couldn't make mistakes. One wrong move, and they would accelerate the process. One show of rage, one outburst, and it would be recorded, weaponized, added to their growing narrative of decline. I had to play the part they wrote for me while writing a different story in secret. I began planning my exit, like a man planning an escape from a soft, well-decorated prison. I knew I needed documents, my ID, my insurance info, my bank records, but Sarah kept those locked in a filing cabinet in the office. I also needed cash. They had taken my debit card, claiming it was lost in the move, and that they'd order a new one soon. I had to find a way to access my accounts before they could lock me out completely. I remembered I had added Ted as a limited user years ago, when he helped me manage some online bills. An innocent decision then, a fatal one now. My only hope was that I still had access before they filed their petition. On Thursday, Sarah left for a shopping run, and Ted went out for a networking breakfast. I watched them leave through the slit in the blinds. I waited 10 minutes, then moved. I went straight to the office, found the cabinet, and pried open the top drawer. The keys were tucked into a small dish by the desk. I sorted quickly. Passport, social security card, old tax forms, insurance paperwork. I found my birth certificate and marriage license. Everything was there, perfectly ordered. That scared me more than if things had been missing. They were preparing, assembling a dossier. They wanted every piece of my identity, and soon they would claim it was theirs to manage. I tucked the most important documents into the waistband of my pants and covered them with my shirt. Then I went to the hallway and retrieved the emergency phone I'd hidden 2 weeks earlier, an old flip phone I'd stashed in the back of my book drawer, with a prepaid card and a contact number of a former colleague from the school district. Her name was Miriam, and she had always said, "Call me if you ever need anything." I dialed her, heart pounding. "Walter," she answered, confused. "Are you okay?" "I need help," I whispered. "I think my son is trying to take legal control over me." There was a pause. "Where are you?" "Still at his house, but I won't be for long." "Do you need a place to go?" "I need a ride. Just to the bus station." "I'll be there in 30. I hung up and shoved the phone deep into my sock. I returned to my room and waited, pacing slowly, glancing at the clock every 30 seconds. At 11:42 a.m., I heard the soft honk of a car from the driveway. It was Miriam, bless her. I grabbed a small bag I'd pre-packed, just essentials, and slipped out the back door. No alarms, no shouting, no questions. I got into her car and didn't look back. She drove me to the station in silence, except for a brief question. "Do you have money?" I nodded, though I didn't. Not yet. I explained the situation quickly, the lies, the documents, the pills. She didn't interrupt. At the terminal, she gave me $40 in cash and hugged me. "You find a lawyer, Walter, and you take them down." That bus ride was the longest of my life, not in time, but in wait. I was free, but I was frightened. I didn't know how far they had gotten with their plan. I didn't know what I had left in the bank or whether my accounts were frozen. I didn't even know if, legally, I still owned my own name. But I knew this. I had escaped in time. I still had breath in my lungs and thoughts in my head, and that meant I could fight back. I wasn't their patient. I wasn't their ward. I was Walter Mace, a man who had once taught students about the rise and fall of empires. And now I would write the history of my own. When I arrived in Hartford, the late autumn wind clawed at my coat and turned every exposed inch of skin into paper. I hadn't traveled alone in years. The bus had dropped me near the old city center where buildings stood gray and permanent, like the columns of some forgotten courthouse. I moved slowly through the streets, not just from fatigue, but from the sense of not belonging. I wasn't a man simply traveling. I was a fugitive of dignity, a father who had run from his own blood, clutching papers and memories like currency. I found a modest inn near the courthouse and paid in cash. The woman at the counter didn't ask questions. I gave her the name Walter H. May, half truthful, enough to avoid recognition should Ted or Sarah think to trace me. I had no doubt they would. The moment they discovered I had left, they would initiate the next stage of their plan. Claim abandonment, feebleness, perhaps file a missing persons report. The only thing worse than having your enemies be strangers is realizing they wear your last name. The room was small, dim, and smelled of old linen and pine-scented cleaner, but it had a desk and a window overlooking the street. I sat down and began writing. Every incident, every date, every detail. The pills, the phone disappearance, the fabricated stories. I included quotes from their conversations, the documents I found, and the overheard phone call. My handwriting was unsteady, but my thoughts had never been clearer. I would create a record they could not erase, a testament to the erosion of my autonomy under the pretense of compassion. The next morning I went to a legal aid office 2 blocks away. I expected bureaucracy, delays, cold coffee and plastic cups. What I got instead was a woman named Rosa Green, an attorney in her 40s who had once specialized in elder care fraud before switching to housing law. She listened to my story with alarming stillness, her pen frozen halfway through her note-taking. When I finished, she said nothing for a long moment, then quietly asked, "Do you have any documentation?" I slid the manila envelope across the desk. Birth certificate, social security card, passport, medical insurance forms, and a printed log of suspicious activities I had written the night before. Rosa flipped through them with a surgical calm, and when she reached the scribbled timeline of incidents, her jaw visibly tightened. "This isn't just neglect," she said at last. "This is an orchestrated campaign to seize guardianship and liquidate your estate, and you're lucky. Most people don't get out in time." Her words made my chest tighten. Not from fear, but recognition. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining this. I had been held captive under the disguise of help. Within an hour, Rosa arranged an emergency injunction to prevent any third party from filing for conservatorship over me without a court hearing. She also helped me file for a formal capacity assessment from an independent medical provider, just to have documentation on record. I was still of sound mind, still in control, and now, thanks to her, there was legal recognition of that. She told me we would also begin the process of reasserting control over my bank accounts and property titles. I hadn't even known until that moment whether my own home, yes, the one I had worked for, paid off, maintained, was still legally mine or if Ted had somehow transferred it. "That'll be our next step," Rosa said. "But I'd bet they've started the paperwork already. We'll have to be fast." She was right. That afternoon, we contacted my bank and discovered that a new request had been submitted to replace my debit card and establish a joint account between myself and Ted Mace. The bank had flagged it because the signatures didn't match. The representative we spoke to, an older gentleman named Byron, recognized my name and voice. He canceled the pending transaction and marked my file for manual verification only. I thanked him and felt, for the first time in weeks, a kind of safety. I wasn't invisible. Not yet. That evening, back in the inn, I allowed myself a moment of rest. I poured a cup of tea from the kettle in the hallway and sat by the window, watching the lights of Hartford flicker in the damp dusk. My thoughts went not to Ted and Sarah, but to Helen. What would she say if she saw all this? Would she have known? Could she have stopped it? I tried to remember the last conversation she had with Ted. It had been short, cautious. She loved him, I knew that, but she never truly trusted him. Not after his third job change. Not after the stories about bad investments. She had once said, in a whisper meant only for me, "He always needs more than he has, and he resents people who have what he wants." I hadn't understood what she meant at the time. Now I did. I was what he wanted. My pension, my house, my silence. 2 days later, I received a call from Rosa. Her voice was tense but measured. "They filed for emergency guardianship this morning," she said. "Claimed you were a danger to yourself, that you wandered off, that you're in the early stages of cognitive decline. They used pharmacy records, likely your prescriptions, and a fabricated medical note from a clinic that doesn't exist." I felt the world narrow into a small, breathless tunnel. "Can they do that?" I asked, my throat dry. "They can try," Rosa replied, "but now they have a real fight on their hands." We filed a formal counterclaim and submitted documentation proving my capacity, location, and medical independence. Rosa also requested an ethics review against the notary who signed the false documents. What stunned me most was the speed with which Ted and Sarah had moved. It had been less than a week since I fled, and already they were trying to legally erase me. I felt a strange sensation. Not grief, not rage, but exposure. The kind you feel when you realize the enemy had been rehearsing while you were still learning the rules. The next part of our plan was to secure my assets. Rosa arranged a forensic review of my property title. We found that Ted had submitted a transfer of interest form for my house in my hometown. He had claimed I was no longer residing at the property, and that it was in the family's interest to assume ownership to prevent decay and mismanagement. He had attached a signed letter from me, dated during a time I was heavily medicated. My signature was shaky, but real. "We can challenge this," Rosa said, "but we'll need witnesses. Someone who can confirm your state at that time." I gave her the name of Miriam and a neighbor named Paul who had stopped by the house during my stay with Ted and Sarah. They remembered the look in my eyes. They remembered how I shuffled when I used to walk with a straight spine. They agreed to testify. What followed was 2 weeks of filings, affidavits, and medical appointments. I visited a psychiatrist and a neurologist, both of whom conducted full cognitive evaluations. Their findings were unequivocal. No signs of dementia, no memory impairment, no indications of incompetency. I wasn't just clear. I was sharper than many men half my age, the doctor said with a smile. I wanted to laugh, but all I felt was a strange sadness, that such a test had even become necessary. During that time, Rosa discovered something else. Ted had emptied a small joint investment account that Helen and I had opened decades ago, a fund meant for college expenses for future grandchildren. The amount wasn't large, just over $12,000, but it was enough to reveal intent. He had named himself as a legal guardian and withdrawn the funds under family necessity. That documentation, coupled with his attempt to declare me incapacitated, formed a pattern, a clear, traceable strategy to isolate, control, and ultimately dispossess. We gathered it all into a single case file, a thick folder filled with timelines, statements, emails, financial records, and medical testimony. Rosa called it the Shield File. "Because," she said, "it may be the only thing that stands between you and total erasure." That phrase stuck with me. I kept the folder by my bed. I read it like scripture before sleep. Not because I needed the details, I lived them, but because it reminded me I had survived them. The final escalation came when Ted called my prepaid phone. It had been silent for days. I nearly didn't answer. But curiosity won. I pressed the green button. "Dad?" His voice was light, uncertain. "Where are you?" I said nothing. "We're worried," he continued. "You left without saying anything. We've been trying to help you. We're filing some things, but it's just for your protection." I exhaled, long and slow. "I know what you're doing," I said, my voice colder than I expected. "I know about the documents, the drugs, the accounts, and I'm not coming back." There was silence. Then his voice sharpened. "You're making a mistake. You need help." "No," I said. "You need to stop." He hung up. That night I didn't sleep. But I wasn't afraid. I knew the next step would be court, and this time I would be ready. The courtroom was smaller than I had imagined, more like a library reading room than the grand halls of justice I'd seen in films. Beige walls, wooden benches polished by years of nervous hands, a single ceiling fan rotating with slow indifference. My shoes squeaked slightly on the tile as I was led to the table where Rosa sat, her notes spread before her in precise stacks. She glanced at me, her eyes calm but razor-focused. "They're here," she whispered. I turned my head slightly and saw Ted and Sarah seated behind the opposing counsel, their clothes neat, expressions composed, as though this were a parent-teacher conference, not a hearing to decide whether their father was legally of sound mind. Ted caught my gaze and gave me a small nod, half greeting, half threat. Sarah didn't look at me. Her hands were folded tightly on her lap, and I noticed her nails were bitten to the quick. The judge entered, an older woman with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun. She looked over her glasses at the room, her tone brisk but not unkind. "We're here to determine the status of guardianship and evaluate the necessity of conservatorship regarding Mr. Walter Mace," she began. The words landed heavily, despite their routine delivery. I sat straighter, forcing my spine into dignity. I was not a case. I was not a ward. I was a man whose life was on trial, not because I had failed, but because I had trusted the wrong people. Their attorney spoke first, a smooth, well-tailored man with the kind of voice that had closed many real estate deals. He described me as a vulnerable senior, using words like erratic behavior, increasing forgetfulness, and episodes of paranoia. He cited the missed medications, the supposed wandering off, the emotional instability witnessed by Ted and Sarah. "My clients have acted only out of love and concern," he concluded, "and wish nothing more than to ensure Mr. Mace's safety." Ted and Sarah nodded solemnly behind him, as if grieving a man already lost. Then Rosa stood, and everything changed. She spoke clearly, steadily, laying out the timeline like laying bricks. Documented control of medications, unauthorized attempts to seize property, the suspicious redirection of mail and financial access. She presented the medical assessments confirming my cognitive capacity, complete with psychiatric evaluations and statements from neutral professionals. Then she lowered her voice slightly and began reading from the transcript of Ted's recorded phone call, the one I had managed to capture just before fleeing. It was short, but damning. "Once the cognitive evaluation comes back, we file. If we wait too long, he might catch on." The room shifted. The judge leaned forward. The opposing counsel objected, but Rosa held up the notarized chain of custody for the audio file. It was legitimate, it was real, and it was the beginning of their unraveling. The judge called a recess and requested private testimony. I was called to the stand first. My knees trembled as I stood, but I made my way forward, one step at a time, clutching the rail for balance. Rosa had prepped me, but nothing could fully prepare you for the moment you're asked, under oath, to defend your own mind. I answered every question carefully, but without hesitation. I recited dates. I recounted events. I even quoted lines from my own teaching days when asked how I spent my time before the movie. "I once told my students," I said, "that the collapse of Rome began not with the swords of invaders, but the silence of its own Senate. Neglect always comes dressed in robes." The judge blinked, then nodded. Ted testified next. He described me as paranoid, obsessed with privacy, withdrawn, unable to manage modern technology. He said I had refused to eat, forgotten names, wandered into traffic. Sarah corroborated it all, her voice trembling at just the right moments, her tissue dabbing her cheek without ever quite touching it. They spoke like actors who had rehearsed for months. But they had not anticipated the weight of the evidence stacked against them. They had not expected the written logs, the witnesses Rosa had summoned, Miriam, the neighbor Paul, even the banker who confirmed their attempt to seize access to my savings. The judge listened, not reacting, her pen moving slowly. Then she asked the question I had been dreading. "Mr. Mace, do you believe your son acted out of malice?" I paused. The room seemed to tighten around me. "I believe," I said slowly, "that he acted out of entitlement." "I don't know if that's worse." Silence followed. And then the gavel came down, not to end the hearing, but to call for judgment. The judge's ruling was firm and immediate. This court finds no evidence to support the claim that Mr. Mace is incapable of managing his own affairs. The petition for emergency guardianship is denied. Furthermore, the court refers the matter of attempted fraudulent property transfer to the appropriate state investigative body. Ted's head jerked slightly, his mouth opening as if to protest. Sarah reached for his hand, but he pulled it away. Their attorney gathered his papers quickly, avoiding eye contact with everyone. I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Outside, Rosa and I walked slowly down the courthouse steps. I asked her, "Is that it?" She smiled faintly. "Legally? Yes, but they may try again. People like that rarely accept consequences." I nodded, knowing she was right, but they would never get that close to me again. That night I returned to my room and opened the window. The air was cold and sharp, but it felt clean. The stars were out, faint and distant. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt like a man who had pulled himself out of a grave someone else had dug for him, barely, bruised but breathing. I sat by the window, the court papers in my lap, and let the wind remind me that I was still, in every important way, alive. In the weeks following the court decision, I found myself relearning what it meant to live without looking over my shoulder. There were no locked doors, no trays of medicated food, no surveillance pretending to be safety. I rented a modest one-bedroom apartment in a quiet town near the coast, not far from where Helen and I once vacationed during the early years of our marriage. It's not a glamorous place. The carpet is thin, and the windows rattle when it rains, but I have a key that only I carry, and a stove I can turn on without permission. That, to me, is freedom now. I walk every morning. I read aloud in the evenings to no one but myself. I keep a calendar pinned beside the fridge and mark off the days not to count time, but to remind myself that I still command it. I haven't heard from Ted since the hearing. No calls, no letters, no half-hearted apologies disguised as concern. I assume he's licking his wounds, or perhaps building a new version of the story where he remains the hero, misunderstood and mistreated by an ungrateful father. Let him. Everyone needs a fiction to sleep through the night. What he doesn't know is that I've rewritten my will. Whatever inheritance he might have counted on, whatever scraps he thought would fall to him by default, they're gone. I set up a trust for a local scholarship fund under Helen's name, one that supports students pursuing public service careers. Maybe it's sentimental. Maybe it's a final act of defiance. I don't really care. It felt right. Sarah, too, has vanished from my periphery. I sometimes wonder if she regrets any of it. If, late at night, she lies awake and remembers the day she served me scrambled eggs and called me a good boy, while plotting to sell the house where I buried my wife's ashes beneath the hydrangea bush. I hope she does. But if she doesn't, that's fine too. Their silence is its own kind of confession. The legal process hasn't entirely ended. There are still calls from Rosa, still forms to sign, accounts to secure, investigators probing the false documents Ted submitted. There may be charges. There may not. That's up to the state now. I told Rosa I wouldn't testify in a criminal trial. Not because I'm afraid, but because I've already done my part. I took my name back. I reclaimed my mind. I no longer owe my pain to the courtroom. I owe it only to myself, and that's enough. Sometimes people ask me, those who know only the barest bones of what happened, whether I feel angry. Whether I hate him, I tell them no. Not really. Anger is exhausting. Hatred corrodes the vessel that holds it. What I feel, more than anything, is distance. Not physical, but moral. A gulf between who I was as a father and who he became as a son. I raised him with stories, with examples, with quiet lessons at the dinner table. I believed that if I lived with decency, he'd inherit it. But values don't transfer like property titles. They have to be chosen again and again, like a vow. Ted chose differently. I don't understand it. I probably never will. I've made new habits. Once a week, I visit the library and read to a group of children during story hour. I bring my own battered books, the ones I read to Ted long ago, and I sit in the corner while little legs dangle from plastic chairs and wide eyes follow my every word. They don't know what I've lived through. They just know I have a gentle voice and that the dragon loses in the end. That's enough. Sometimes I talk to Helen. Not in a ghostly way, not out loud. Just quietly, inwardly. I tell her I got out. I tell her I remembered who I was. I imagine she'd be proud, not because I won a case, but because I didn't let our life be rewritten by someone who never built it. The hydrangea bush still blooms, I hear. A neighbor wrote me after they noticed someone tried to dig it up and then abandoned the effort. Maybe Ted thought better of disturbing it. Maybe the roots were too deep, like me. And so I live. Not loudly, not triumphantly, but truthfully. That, in the end, is the only revenge I need. Not vengeance, not punishment, just clarity, just peace, just the quiet satisfaction of knowing that I endured, not as their version of me, but as my own.